Thanks for staying with us here on The Real Story. Housing affordability, accessibility, and overall justice, all big issues last session and now this session too. A crowded and tense public hearing heard hundreds of residents talking about tenant protections and the fears and challenges they face. Joining us now are two tenant organizers, Luke Malakanos-Harrison, the Vice President of the Connecticut Tenants Union, and Amanda Watts, Vice President of the Chapel Street Tenants Union. Thank you both so much for being here with us.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
So Luke, we'll start with you. Tell me a little bit about how you got into organizing for housing justice and about how the Connecticut Tenants Union got started.
For me, my start into housing justice organizing came from being a homeless outreach worker. I was working with individuals who were struggling with issues that all eventually, ultimately came down to the fact that they lacked a roof over their head. And trying to connect people to medical services and social services and all of these other resources was so incredibly difficult without people just having the basic need of housing in place. And so that really pushed me to think about how, if I want to do something about homelessness, it's got to start further upstream. It's got to be about tenant rights and people's ability to stay in their homes and not end up homeless in the first place. And so that's how I got involved in tenant union organizing, because ultimately what we're trying to do as the Connecticut Tenants Union is shift the power imbalance between tenants and landlords so that people have more say and chance to advocate for themselves and stay in their homes and not end up out on the street.
And Amanda, you were part of the start of the new Chapel Street Apartment Union, the second ever organized in New Haven. Tell me a little bit about your apartment complex and how did that unionizing start and sort of where has it gone from there?
Yeah, definitely. We've had a negligent and predatory landlord in Ocean Management, and we found that we just weren't being paid attention to and our living conditions were really deplorable. And my fight really started as an individualistic one, where I just wanted my needs to be met. Like, I wanted my radiators to stop screeching so that I wouldn't be woken up at night. But then I met Luke, actually the second day that I moved into Chapel Street, and reached out to him a couple months later after I was really fed up with these problems, and was really introduced into the movement and shown how many people were actually dealing with similar issues that I was dealing with. So I felt pushed by Luke and other organizers and divinely to use my skills that I had gained in my life so far to help galvanize people and realize their power that we can use collectively. But first I had to realize my power and just help us push things forward. So now we were recently bought out by another landlord called Vector Residential, and they bought us out in, I think, around August. And from there, things are going a bit better, but the situation is different now. The monster is different because that landlord is a gentrifying landlord. In my first conversation with the property manager, he admitted that we would be kind of pushed out of our homes. Like, he said that there would be new rules that would be enacted so that the culture of our living would change, so that, quote, doctors and students would feel more comfortable in the space. So we were dealing with a different monster. They are more attentive than Ocean was, but that's not saying much because Ocean was completely inattentive. So yeah, we're just trying to figure things out,
Yeah, and Connecticut undoubtedly has a housing crisis, from renting to ownership to homelessness, and obviously it's not just Connecticut, it's nationwide as well. All 50 states are seeing this. And it's really the talk of the chambers. I think once again this session we've heard from lots of lawmakers about all different aspects of housing they want to try and address this short session. So, as tenants and residents, what are some of the issues that you really want lawmakers to focus on and get serious about this session? Luke, we can start with you.
Yeah. So our legislative priority for the session right now is an expansion of an existing law that Connecticut has had for over 40 years, but that only protects currently a small subcategory of renters.
Right.
we're trying to expand that to cover nearly all renters with a small exception. And that's called just cause eviction protection, which it has it in the name. The idea is that an eviction could only be carried out against someone for a just cause and not for no reason at all, which some may be surprised to learn is actually currently legal for tenants to be evicted, not because they've broken a lease, not because they're not paying their rent, not because they're harming their neighbors, but simply because the landlord wants them out for whatever reason, which lends itself to all kinds of abuses. And particularly, as Connecticut Tenants Union, what we've seen is people reaching out to us because they're dealing with unsafe and unhealthy living conditions because their rent is being raised dramatically and unfairly and they can't afford it. And they start to advocate and organize and form tenant unions and call code enforcement and exercise their existing rights.
Right.
And then so often that is met with a retaliatory eviction or a threat of it, which, as you can imagine, has a real chilling effect on people's ability to even protect the rights that they do currently have legally. So this has happened over and over again, and we've also seen, situations like Amanda's building and many buildings around the state where a new investor will come in and kind of make the calculation that if they just clear out all of the existing residents, they can oftentimes just merely slap on a new coat of paint, massively increase the rent, much more than is reasonable or fair, but bring in a new cohort of higher income, higher paying tenants because of the housing crisis that we're in. And we're seeing that happen in a way that is destabilizing communities and really disrupting people's lives. And just cause eviction would slow that process down and maintain the remaining affordable housing that we do have. Right now, we're losing affordable housing faster than we're building it, and just cause getting it past this session will really help preserve our affordable housing and protect tenant rights.
We saw, more than 200 people signed up to speak this past week at a public hearing on this bill, and to clarify, only those protected right now are those 62 years and older, and anyone with a registered disability. But as you mentioned, that leaves a whole swath of people not included under that umbrella. So, Amanda, tell me how it felt to see that turnout this past week at that hearing, and is there anything that you hope lawmakers on the Housing Committee took away after that public hearing?
Yeah, it felt incredible to feel supported again by the community, and I just really hope that the lawmakers actually listen to our stories, listen to the conditions that we've been subjected to and the negligence, and I just hope that they actually use their power and be courageous and just meet tenants where we are, because as Luke mentioned, we as tenant organizers and as tenant unions, we're already organizing in our own buildings, for fighting for better conditions, but we have this fear of eviction hanging over our heads. I can talk about the real difference that this eviction protection expansion would do for my neighbors, because we have been made to live with rodents and live with mold, and even as all of the positive attention that my neighbors and me have been getting, people in my building are still afraid to fight and stand up for their rights, because they tell me that's just an excuse for the landlord to push us out. So, and it's no coincidence that most of my neighbors are Black. And many of them are disabled as well. So there's just a chilling effect, as was mentioned, that just keeps people from using their rights and using the resources and tools. So I just hope that lawmakers meet us where we are in this fight.
Well, and that hearing obviously went on for hours because, as we said, there were more than 200 people signed up to testify, and I was there covering it. It was definitely tense at some points, if not a little bit the whole time. Yeah. But I'll start with Amanda. Tell me about where you saw pushback at all from lawmakers and what, in your opinion, could potentially block this legislation this session.
Yeah, I saw pushback. There was a lot of talk about individual property rights and how just landowners and landlords should be able to do with their property whatever they want to. I heard that landlords have been like threatened by tenants and things like that, and because of that, this reason to evict people should be preserved, but they're not capturing the fact that tenants still can be evicted for those reasons, like now, because of it being a nuisance or violating their lease agreements. So I just hope that, sorry, I lost my train of thought.
No, you're
It's all
fine.
good.
Well, but during that hearing, we did hear that from a lot of lawmakers about property owners' rights as well, and we even heard from some local landlords who said, for them, the no-cause eviction is kind of a last resort tool. Luke, do you have any response to that from what you heard, from those in opposition of this bill?
Yeah, I think that point about how a lot of landlords were saying it's a tool of last resort, and yet there seemed to be a real reaction to, expanding this existing protection. And when we look at the data, we can see the exact percentage of evictions that fall into this category. It's about 11% right now, and it's actually increasing. So while evictions overall are also increasing, which reflects the severity of the housing crisis that tenants are facing, no-fault evictions specifically are increasing at a faster rate than evictions overall. So this category of eviction clearly is including more things than simply a highly aggressive tenant who's causing problems, but is yet not causing significant enough problems to where the landlord could prove it in court. Because again, just cause eviction would still allow for eviction for justified reasons. It's simply giving the tenant the chance to tell their side of the story, rather than only one side of the equation having complete control over interpreting events and things that are happening in the building. It's giving tenants a chance to tell their side of the story. So for me, I heard those stories and it just doesn't quite add up in terms of the numbers. If the only reason they're using no-fault evictions is to deal with highly problematic tenants, I have a hard time believing that explains the 11% of total evictions that fall into this category, and the fact that it's increasing more quickly than other types of eviction. When I look at those numbers, what I'm seeing is, again, this rapid increase in this business practice of clearing out whole buildings of people at a time, disrupting communities, and I just want to take a moment to really reflect on what that means. When somebody is served a lapse of time eviction because their landlord wants to flip it and bring in a whole new cohort of people are embedded in their communities. They're close to where their kids go to school. They're close to where they have their doctor's appointments, where they have a social network and a feeling of community, where people who have lived next to each other for a long time have trust and a sense of neighborliness in a building. And for that to be disrupted overnight because someone has calculated that they could make an even higher profit than what they're already making, we as a state really need to ask ourselves, is that a social cost and a social burden that makes sense to us, especially when we see how homelessness is increasing, and when we think about the impacts of eviction on people's health and well-being and our community's well-being. It's a cost-benefit analysis for me. And again, the counter arguments that we have to preserve this type of eviction simply to deal with nuisance tenants is not adding up with what we're seeing and hearing on the ground.
Well, Luke, Amanda, thank you both so much. Unfortunately, that's all the time we have, but as we've said, a really big issue and one we'll be continuing to cover throughout this session. Thank you both again for being here.
Thank you so much.
And that does it for us here on The Real Story, but if you want to watch these segments again, you can head to fox61.com or download the free Fox 61 News app and watch The Real Story every Sunday at 10 a.m. right here on Fox 61 and streaming on Fox 61 Plus. Have a great rest of your morning.